July 2nd, 1906, New York County Courthouse, Manhattan. A clerk sits at a high desk worn smooth by decades of elbows. The air is summer-heavy, but the room is built to resist weather. Tall windows. A ceiling meant for gravity, not comfort. On the desktop, a stack of papers that arrive too quickly to be ordinary. A complaint, a preliminary report, names written in firm ink, then rewritten by another hand as the case moves from one office to the next. A docket book lies open, columns ruled with a precision that treats every human moment as a line item. The clerk does not look up when the door opens. He listens for the sound that matters, the shuffle of an officer's shoes, the scrape of a chair, the small cough of an attorney who has already decided which facts will be admitted and which will be fought. A rubber stamp is pressed into an ink pad, lifted, pressed down again. The paper takes the imprint without protest. In another room, the weapon has already been tagged, the bullets counted. The theater ticket taken from a pocket and sealed as an exhibit. Someone has written the location plainly, because paperwork requires plainness. Madison Square Garden Rooftop Theater. Someone has written the time. Someone has written the result. 1 dead, 1 arrested, 1 woman whose name will now travel faster than any train can carry her. The case file begins to acquire weight, the way a city's stories always do, by accumulation, a bank draft for bail, a receipt for an impounded revolver, the hospital certificate that ends a life in a single sentence, the marriage certificate that explains why a socialite is now central to a homicide file, the society columns that will translate legal language into appetite. A witness list is started, then amended, then started again because the first list cannot hold what this will become. Outside, the courthouse steps face a street that can absorb anything. Streetcars, messengers, men in straw hats reading headlines before they pay for them. The city has learned to keep moving even when its attention is pinned to one name. The name on everyone's lips is not the dead man's alone. It is the name of the woman in the middle of the triangle, Evelyn Nesbit, whose beauty was made into a commodity before she was old enough to vote, and whose marriage to a Pittsburgh fortune will be presented as romance, as rescue, as transaction, as trap. And the file continues to thicken, not because the facts are complicated, but because Manhattan is complicated, because money is complicated, because reputation is an asset that can be protected, traded, pledged, or destroyed, because a scandal is not an explosion. It is a supply chain of letters, introductions, hotel registers, private rooms, theater seats, and the quiet decisions made in offices like this one. The question is not whether a man pulled a trigger. The question is what Manhattan had already built, socially, financially, architecturally, that made the trigger pull feel inevitable. Chapter 1. The Photograph. Before the courthouse file, there is a smaller archive. Cardboard-backed prints sold by the dozen, passed from hand to hand until the corners soften. Evelyn Nesbit is born on April 25, 1884 in Tarentum, Pennsylvania, into a family that can be described, in the language of the time, as respectable and strained. Her father is a lawyer. The household has the posture of stability. It does not have the reserves. When her father dies, the math of survival changes. The 20th century is approaching, but the labor market for women remains old. Respectable work is narrow, wages are smaller, rooms are rented by the week, food is bought in quantities that match the cash on hand, not the week ahead. Her mother moves the family in search of a safer equation, Philadelphia, then New York. Each move is a set of costs, rail tickets, trunks, deposits, the loss of any local help. Each move is also a wager. New York pays better, if it pays at all. In Manhattan, at the turn of the century, an ambitious girl can become visible without becoming wealthy. Visibility has its own economy. Studios need faces, illustration needs figures, department store advertising needs an ideal that can be printed and reprinted. The city produces images the way it produces garments, by division of labor. One person designs, another prints, another sells. The model is the raw material that makes the system plausible. Evelyn Nesbit's rise begins in this machinery, not in ballrooms. She poses for photographers and artists. Her face becomes recognizable in a way that has nothing to do with old families and everything to do with reproduction. Paper copies stacked in a shop, postcards mailed across state lines, magazine pages that can be torn out and kept. Her beauty becomes a form of public property, but the payments do not turn her into a wealthy woman. They keep the household afloat. They buy time. The city she moves through is a city obsessed with surfaces and built on underlying ledgers. Fifth Avenue's mansions rise with stone and carved ornament, but their presence is justified by bank balances and share certificates. Broadway is bright, but it is bright because investors believe the receipts will cover the gas lights and the salaries and the rent. Hotels are palaces, and yet every room has a rate, every meal a charge, every bouquet an invoice. In this New York, power is not only inherited, it is curated. There are social routes, families that control invitations, clubs that control access, churches that control respectability. But there are also commercial routes, theater managers, photographers, fashion houses, restaurateurs. A young woman without a family name can still be brought into rooms with powerful men if her presence increases the room's value. The photograph is her passport, but it is not protection. By the early 1900s, Evelyn is moving in a world where older men can sponsor, mentor, or purchase proximity without admitting which role they have chosen. The transactions are not always documented, but their traces remain in places that do keep records. Theater programs, hotel registers, carriage hires, jewelry bills, leases signed by intermediaries. She is still a teenager when the city begins to treat her as a finished product. And this is the first turning point, not because it is dramatic, but because it is logistical. Once a face becomes famous, it draws men who want to own the story behind it. Once a girl becomes an image, she becomes a target for control. By contracts, by gifts, by promises of training, by the promise of introduction into society, as if society were a building with a front desk. The physical New York of that moment still exists in fragments. The grid remains. Broadway remains. The idea of the studio remains, even if the addresses change. The public library remains as an archive of the magazines that once carried her likeness. And in the city's long memory, the early photographs of Evelyn Nesbit remain a kind of pre-crime evidence, proof that the scandal's raw material was visible before anyone decided what to do with it. The question is not whether a beautiful girl could become famous in Manhattan. The question is what the city required her to trade, quietly, to stay famous and fed. Chapter 2. The Red Velvet Ledger. The men who collected Manhattan in that era collected it the way they collected property, through keys. Keys to private dining rooms. Keys to apartments kept for pleasure rather than for family. Keys to clubs whose membership lists functioned like credit ratings. Keys to buildings that were symbols before they were shelter. Stanford White is not merely an individual in this story. He is an institution with a signature. He is one of the era's best-known architects, a partner in McKim, Mead & White, a firm that shapes the skyline and the taste of the wealthy. In a city newly confident in its money, architecture becomes a language of dominance. Grand staircases, marble halls, columns that imitate ancient power. White helps the rich translate cash into permanence, and he also moves through the city's private life with a fluency that is not architectural. He knows how to place people in rooms. He knows what a young actress can mean to a dinner. He knows how a patron can appear generous while also tightening control. Evelyn Nesbit meets Stanford White while still very young. Her entry into his orbit is not recorded in a courthouse ledger at first. It is recorded in the softer archives of social life. Dinner invitations, carriage rides, rooms whose leases are not signed by the people who use them. Later, after the shooting, the relationship will be described in sworn testimony and newspaper language, each side shaping the past for a jury. What matters for the city's mechanics is that a powerful older man takes an interest in a famous teenage model, and the interest comes with benefits that look like rescue, clothing, meals, apartments, the kind of support that can be framed as mentorship while operating like possession. There is a pattern Manhattan understands very well: the conversion of wealth into access, and access into obligation. White's position allows him to offer not only money but legitimacy. He can place a young woman among famous people. He can normalize her presence in expensive rooms. He can provide the sense that she is protected by proximity to status. But protection in Manhattan often means insulation, not safety. It means problems are kept quiet, not prevented. The turning point in this chapter is not a single night, because the historical record is a tangle of claims, denials, and later recollections. The turning point is structural. Evelyn Nesbit becomes entangled with a man whose public authority is immense and whose private life is permissive. And she is too young, too economically exposed, and too socially unguarded to set the terms. This is where the scandal's future paperwork begins to form in embryo, not in court, in letters, in resentments, in the creation of a grievance that will later be given a legal costume. What remains today is both concrete and ghostly. Stanford White's buildings remain part of New York's visual grammar. Facades and arches and interiors shaped by his firm still stand, visited by tourists who do not think about the private parties that once moved behind other doors. The very idea of an architect as celebrity, someone whose taste becomes a social instrument, endures, and the city's archives still hold. The newspapers that turned private accusations into public spectacle. In Manhattan, influence can build temples and also build traps. The same hands that draw grand entrances can close other doors. Chapter 3. The Ring and the Contract. Harry Kendall Thaw comes from a different kind of permanence: industrial money, family control, and a reputation that is managed like a business. Pittsburgh wealth at the turn of the century is heavy wealth, money made from steel, coal, rail logistics, and the infrastructure of a nation's growth. It does not need Manhattan's approval to exist, but it often wants Manhattan's social certificate to complete the picture. Thaw is rich enough to be treated as important before he has proven himself. He can purchase the outward forms of sophistication: travel, tailored clothes, seats in the right places, introductions brokered by people who recognize money as a universal language. And he becomes fixated on Evelyn Nesbit. In the story that will later be marketed to the public, he is the romantic rescuer, the man who will lift her out of a dangerous world. In the story that emerges in court, he is also a man who wants to control the narrative of her past, to own her future, and to rewrite her history as if it were an account book with inconvenient entries. The courtship is long, expensive, and structured. That alone is a fact worth watching. People do not spend sustained money without expecting a return. Gifts accumulate. Travel is arranged. The machinery of wealth is used to make a young woman feel that her options have narrowed to one choice. Marriage, in that era, is a legal instrument as much as a personal one. It changes property expectations. It changes reputational alliances. It changes who can speak for whom, who can sign, who can confine. On April 4th, 1905, Evelyn Nesbit and Harry K. Thaw marry in Pittsburgh. A marriage certificate is filed, names are written, ages, addresses. The state recognizes the union with an administrative calm that makes no comment on motive. This is what the city and the law do best: transform human volatility into standardized form. After the wedding, the travel begins. Europe is not only a honeymoon backdrop, it is a stage for status. Hotels, steamship cabins, trunks with labels, cash exchanged into foreign currency, tips paid for doors to open. It is also a place where isolation can be disguised as luxury. A husband can keep a wife constantly moving away from familiar allies by calling it a grand tour. As the marriage progresses, the logic of the relationship becomes clearer through what is controlled. Which letters are sent? Which visits are allowed? Which acquaintances are approved? What is purchased and what is denied? Money does not simply provide, it governs. Thaw's obsession with Evelyn's past becomes one of the story's engines. The question of what happened between Evelyn and Stanford White is no longer only personal. It becomes a fuel source. It is turned into evidence of insult, evidence of contamination, evidence of a wrong that must be answered. The more Thaw insists on this past, the more he binds his own identity to correcting it. This is the turning point of Chapter 3. The marriage does not end the scandal. It formalizes it. It gives the grievance a legal stake and a public face. It transforms Evelyn Nesbit from a young woman with a famous photograph into a wife tied to a fortune, and therefore into a symbol with value beyond herself. And the physical traces are still there, in the way Manhattan keeps traces of everything. Marriage records remain in government archives. Steamship passenger lists remain in printed form and in institutional collections. Newspapers record their movements because society columns function like surveillance for the wealthy. The sites that will matter later, the theater, the clubs, the hotels, remain as addresses even when buildings change. By the time the couple returns to New York, the city is already prepared to convert their private pressure into public theater. Manhattan does not need to be taught how to do this. It has been practicing for decades. The question is not whether a marriage can stabilize a life. The question is what a marriage becomes when it is used as a contract for power, revenge, and ownership. Chapter 4. The Ticket Stub. June 25, 1906, Madison Square Garden, Roof Garden Theater. Night in Manhattan in early summer is not dark. It is layered. Electric signage, gaslight, reflections in windows, the pale sweep of street lamps over wet stone. The city keeps its own hours, and the wealthy keep them later. Madison Square Garden sits on the edge of the square, like a machine built for public appetite. It is a venue, a landmark, and a social stage. It is also, in a quiet irony, the newspapers will not let go, a building associated with Stanford White's world. He is not simply present in the crowd. His work has shaped the environment that flatters the crowd. On the roof, the theater is an elevated room, open to air, tables, chairs, servers moving between them, programs folded and unfolded, a performance marketed as lightness, a comedy meant to pass quickly. The audience expects novelty and ease. This is how a scandal begins in a city like New York, not with shouting, with a ticket purchased, a seat taken, and the normal trust that nothing in a public place will turn into a private reckoning. Harry Kendall Thaw arrives with Evelyn. He has money, and he uses it the way the city expects money to be used. It buys entry, it buys proximity, it buys the right to be seen. Stanford White is there too, sitting with a party of his own. On paper, the relationships that bring these three into the same room are not complicated. A former patron, a husband, a wife. But Manhattan is not a paper city. It is a layered city. People share rooms while living in different moral systems, and they do it because the city rewards those who can keep contradictions standing. Thaw is carrying something that does not belong in the room. A small pistol has weight out of proportion to its size. It is an object built for one purpose, and it changes the meaning of everything around it. It can pass through a pocket unnoticed. It cannot pass through history unnoticed. The music reaches its final stretch. A chorus, a bright end. Contemporary accounts will later place the moment during the finale of the show, while the crowd's attention is designed to be lifted and dispersed. Thaw moves. There is no speech that matters here. Any reported sentence becomes part of the theater afterward, part of the courtroom drama, part of the newspaper's need to give an action a caption. What matters is the distance, close enough to make aim a formality, close enough that the act is unmistakably personal. 3 shots. 2 strike Stanford White in the face. 1 strikes his upper body. The crowd does not immediately know what it has seen. People in public places often assume the public place is safe. For a moment, some think it is staged. A trick. A grotesque flourish meant to match the rooftop's reputation for spectacle. Then the body's stillness begins to explain the truth faster than any announcement. Servers stop moving. Chairs scrape. Women stand with their hands held strangely, as if their gloves have suddenly become a problem. Men lean forward, then pull back, because proximity now has risk. White is dead that night, and the event is instantly larger than its participants. The killing does not remain a murder. It becomes a citywide audit of its own secrets. Within minutes, the roof garden is no longer a theater. It is a scene, a place where objects will be named and collected. A pistol, spent cartridges, a program dropped under a chair moved by someone who will later insist they did not move it, a ticket stub that becomes evidence that the night was planned, scheduled, paid for. Thaw does not run. He does not disappear into the dark the way a poor criminal might try to. His wealth has taught him something else, that the system is navigable, that lawyers can be summoned, that a story can be managed if it is managed immediately. Police arrive to do what police always do in Manhattan when money is involved. They control the perimeter. They control the flow of bodies. They control the first written version of events, because the first written version is often the most durable. The name of the killer is recorded. The name of the victim is recorded. The name of the wife, inevitably, is recorded. Evelyn is no longer simply present. She is implicated by proximity. Her history is now part of the prosecution's future work and the defense's future performance. Her face, already famous in photographs, becomes a symbol. The city has already learned her features. Now it attaches them to blood. The machinery starts immediately. A medical response. A coroner's involvement. A case file opened. A newspaper office sending runners to the courthouse, to the police station, to the hotels where the wealthy might be hiding, to the telephone operators who might have heard something. The scandal becomes an industry in a single night. And yet, even in the chaos, the city keeps its administrative calm. A death is recorded, an arrest is recorded, evidence is tagged. A murderer's name is entered into a book. The question is not whether a man can be killed in public. The question is how Manhattan turns a killing into a ledger that will be read for years. What physically remains today is both obvious and absent. The roof garden theater is gone with the old garden, but the square is still there, and the city's habit of public entertainment, layered over private transactions, remains. Stanford White's work remains in the city's visual fabric, and his burial place is known and visitable, a quiet address against the noise of his death. The newspapers from the days after the shooting remain preserved in archives, still carrying the first drafts of the myth. Chapter 5. The headline. June 26, 1906. Manhattan wakes into print. A scandal becomes real in America when it becomes legible. ink, type, a name repeated until it feels like a public property. The first morning after the shooting, the city's newsstands are loaded with certainty. The papers do not ask quietly. They announce, they simplify, they sell. Manhattan is already accustomed to wealthy men behaving badly. What makes this different is the combination of public violence and private sex, pulled into the same frame. The city can forgive indulgence if it remains expensive and discreet. It cannot ignore a gunshot in a rooftop theater. The story has everything a mass newspaper economy requires: a famous architect, a millionaire heir, a beautiful model, a marriage, a whispered history of rooms and gifts and control, a killing that can be described as jealousy, honor, madness, or revenge, depending on what the reader is hungry to believe. The state begins its work, but the press begins its own work in parallel. The police station becomes a place of pilgrimage for reporters. The courthouse becomes a place of staging. Lawyers begin to appear as faces, not merely as names on documents. The prosecution and the defense are both aware of a new fact of modern urban life. Public opinion does not wait for verdicts. Thaw's family resources activate quickly. Money moves through channels that do not show themselves in the daily papers but can be inferred by their effects. Experienced counsel, private physicians, advisors who understand that a rich man's life can be saved not only by legal argument but by framing. The defense begins to shape the core claim that will dominate the years ahead. Not simply that Thaw killed, which is undeniable, but why, and whether the law should treat the killing as crime or as exception. In the newspapers, Evelyn Nesbit becomes less a person than a conduit. Everything flows through her: her childhood, her photographs, her stage appearances, her alleged experiences with Stanford White, her marriage, her movements in Europe. Every detail becomes a commodity. This is not accidental, it is structural. Evelyn's life has already been made legible to strangers through images. The press can build a narrative around her faster than it can around men whose private lives are hidden behind clubs and offices. She is the part of the story the public feels entitled to consume. Soon, a single image will dominate the way she is remembered: the red velvet swing. The swing is not a courtroom object. It is a storytelling object, a prop that collapses a complex relationship into one vivid picture. A room painted in deep color, ivy-twined ropes, a young girl placed into motion by an older man who has built half the city's respectable shells. It is the kind of image a newspaper can print in the reader's mind, even if no photograph exists of the moment. When the case reaches trial, Evelyn's testimony will be treated as both evidence and spectacle. The transcript will make her experiences sound procedural. The papers will make them feel like confession. Her words, filtered through stenography and reprinted with relish, will turn her into the girl in the red velvet swing, a phrase that traps her inside a single scene. The city watches because the city suspects what the case suggests: that the private lives of the very rich are not morally higher, only better insulated. Institutions respond in the way institutions always do when a scandal threatens to stain their legitimacy. Some distance themselves. Some say nothing. Some quietly remove names from invitation lists. Some keep attending dinners because the social cost of absence is too high. In the meantime, the legal case advances through necessary steps: indictment, hearings, motions, the slow conversion of chaos into procedure. Every step produces paper. Every step creates a trail that can be revisited. This is how Manhattan stores violence: in files. The phrase "trial of the century" begins to appear in the culture because the story has become a test, not only of Thaw's guilt, but of whether wealth can shape the law's outcome, of whether a woman's past can be used as justification for a man's act, of whether the city's admired creators are also its predators. The turning point in this chapter is the moment the scandal outgrows the murder. The death of Stanford White becomes, in public life, the pretext for a broader excavation. The case is no longer only about June 25, 1906. It becomes about a decade of New York's behavior under electric light. And once that happens, the participants lose control. Thaw is now both defendant and symbol. White is now both victim and symbol. Evelyn is now both witness and symbol. The city does not allow symbols to remain private. It forces them into print. The question is not whether the newspapers exaggerate. The question is what exaggeration allows a city to confess without changing. What physically remains today is the paper itself. The Library of Congress preserves the era's newspaper record, and its curated guides to the reporting show how quickly the story became national property. The printed testimony survives in multiple archives. The phrases and images survive as cultural residue, still attached to Evelyn's name more tightly than her own later life ever will be. Chapter 6. The Sequestered Room. January 23, 1907, New York. The courtroom becomes a kind of factory. Each day begins the same way. Doors open, men remove hats, the press settles in. Lawyers arrange their papers. Stenographers prepare to catch every sentence in a form that can be reprinted before the day is over. The judge enters. The room rises. The room sits. The case is officially the people of the state of New York against Harry Kendall Thaw. But the audience knows the real contest is broader. The state against a fortune, the law against a narrative, private conduct against public stability. Because the case has drawn extraordinary attention, the jury is handled with extraordinary control. Sequestration is not a dramatic device. It is logistics. 12 citizens removed from their routines, placed under supervision, cut off from newspapers, from the casual contamination of headlines and gossip. The court tries to build a temporary world where deliberation is possible. Even this has cost. Meals, lodging, supervision, the quiet labor of keeping jurors from information in a city built to distribute information. The prosecution does what the law expects. It anchors itself to the simplest line. Thaw shot White. Thaw did it in public. Thaw did it in a setting where witnesses are unavoidable. The physical facts of the killing are not contested, so the defense must work elsewhere. It works in the terrain of motive, sanity, and moral framing. It turns the courtroom into a place where a woman's history is examined as if it were a document attached to the act. It turns Evelyn Nesbit's past into a kind of exhibit. When Evelyn takes the stand, her presence changes the temperature of the room. Not because she speaks theatrically, she does not need to, because the public has already built her as a character, and the courtroom is now the place where the character is made official. Her testimony about Stanford White's private rooms and the red velvet swing becomes one of the trial's defining images, not because it introduces a new legal fact about the shooting, but because it gives the defense a moral landscape. It provides a frame in which the act can be described not as simple murder, but as consequence. In the process, Stanford White is tried in absence. The dead man's health is discussed. His habits are discussed. His alleged private life is discussed. The city's beloved architect becomes a figure. The press can call brilliant one day and depraved the next. The courtroom becomes a place where reputation is dismantled under oath, because dismantling it is useful to someone still alive. This is how money fights in public, not by denying facts that cannot be denied, by changing what the facts mean. The first trial runs for weeks. The jury listens to a story that is not linear but layered. Evelyn's youth, White's attention, Thaw's obsession, the marriage, the return, the rooftop theater, the gun. The court tries to keep the case tethered to June 25, 1906. The defense keeps pulling it backward, insisting that the real event occurred earlier. in rooms the city prefers not to name. Then finally, the case is handed to the jurors. April 11th, 1907. Deliberations begin. They deliberate for 47 hours. They do not reach unity. The split is recorded and becomes part of the public story. 7 for guilt, 5 against. A mistrial. In a city built on decisive transactions, indecision feels like failure, but legally it is a pause, not an ending. The machinery continues. Another trial will be scheduled. Another strategy will be refined. Another set of papers will be filed. The turning point of Chapter 6 is this deadlock. The trial that was expected to deliver a clear moral verdict delivers only proof that the city's values are divided. The law has been offered 2 narratives: murder as crime, or murder as an act made understandable by a woman's past and a man's claimed mental collapse. The jurors cannot agree on which story should control the meaning of the gunshots. Outside the courtroom, life resumes, but the case does not fade. It has already dug its channels through American attention. The newspapers will keep printing. The lawyers will keep preparing. The defendant will keep being treated as both criminal and curiosity. The question is not whether 12 people can disagree. The question is, what kind of city produces a crime so famous that disagreement becomes its own verdict? What physically remains today is unusually concrete for a scandal of this age. Trial accounts and transcripts survive in institutional collections, including dedicated archives of the proceedings and digital collections that preserve the case as a study object. The printed record still carries the courtroom's rhythm: question, answer, objection, ruling, and the slow construction of a public myth through administrative speech. Chapter 7. The Commitment Warrant, January 1908, New York County Courthouse. The second trial does not begin with surprise. It begins with paper. A new calendar entry, a new panel called, a new set of names written into a ledger. The same corridors, the same wooden benches polished by waiting, the same routine of rising when the judge enters, the same stenographers preparing to turn breath into permanent lines. The city is different now, not because its buildings have changed, but because its attention has been trained. Everyone knows what kind of story this is. Everyone knows where the most valuable moments will occur. Everyone knows which names pull readers to the newsstands. In the months between the mistrial and the retrial, the machinery has kept turning. Lawyers have rehearsed what will be admitted and what will be resisted. Witnesses have been approached again. Memories have been refreshed, sometimes honestly, sometimes strategically. There has been time for private negotiations about what can be said without tearing too much fabric from families that cannot afford to look torn. It is not a trial happening in isolation. It is a trial occurring inside a city that is already talking about it as if the verdict is a referendum on itself. The prosecution comes back with the same unavoidable foundation. The killing is not in dispute. The weapon is not in dispute. The witnesses are not in dispute. This remains, in the clean language of procedure, a homicide committed in public. But the defense is no longer selling the possibility of doubt. It is selling a diagnosis. This is the pivot that matters. If the jury cannot be made to believe the defendant is innocent, it can be made to believe he is not fully responsible. The argument is not that the hand did not fire. The argument is that the mind behind the hand cannot be held to the usual standard. In this era, insanity is not an abstract concept in a courtroom. It is an administrative category that leads to a specific place: a hospital with locked wards, a superintendent with authority, a record system built for people whose lives must be tracked and contained. The defense is asking the jury not only to interpret the killing, but to choose the institution that will receive the killer. The trial's atmosphere is shaped by something more than evidence. It is shaped by fatigue. The first trial has already produced a national spectacle. The public has already consumed the most lurid parts. The history of private rooms, the imbalance of age and power, the image of a young woman turned into a symbol. The second trial has to work on an audience that believes it has already seen the climax. So the second trial becomes, in its most important passages, more clinical. It is filled with medical terms, assessments, and professional authority. Doctors are brought in not to explain blood, but to explain temperament, not to describe a wound, but to describe a mind. The defense leans on the idea that the defendant's obsession was not merely jealousy, but pathology, that it was not merely anger, but compulsion, that it was not merely a plan, but a collapse. The court must translate this into legal meaning. The jury is asked, in effect, to accept two truths at once, that the act was deliberate enough to be carried out, and yet not deliberate enough to be fully punishable. It is a strange hinge for justice to swing on, but justice in a modern city often depends on hinges, categories, definitions, the way a sentence is framed. Evelyn Nesbit is still present in the story, but her function is now more fully understood by the courtroom. She is not only a witness to a private past, she is the object around which the defendant claims his mind reorganized itself. The court does what courts do in famous cases. It tries to keep the human parts from spilling too far beyond what procedure can hold. It fails repeatedly because procedure is not built for celebrity. Outside, in the streets, Manhattan continues. Bank counters open. Lunch is served in rooms where men read headlines without admitting they are interested. The theater district still fills at night. The city does not stop producing ordinary life just because an extraordinary story is being processed. It simply produces both at once. Inside the courthouse, the defense is assembling a map that leads away from Sing Sing and toward Matteawan. Matteawan State Hospital for the Criminally Insane is not a metaphor. It is a physical destination up the Hudson Valley, built to contain people whose crimes the law has decided to interpret through illness. It has walls, wards, routines, restraints that can be documented. It has forms. The defense does not need the public to love the defendant. It needs the jury to choose the institution over the gallows, and it needs them to do it while telling themselves they are not rewarding wealth but recognizing incapacity. The prosecution tries to bring the story back to the simplest measure of accountability. He carried a gun into a public place and shot a man at close range. He chose the time and the location. He did not fire in confusion. He fired in focus. The defense answers by arguing that focus is not always sanity, that obsession can be orderly, that a man can move with purpose and still be moving under a mind that is not intact. The second trial moves toward its end the way heavy things do, slowly, inevitably, with everyone in the room aware that the verdict will not only decide a man's fate, but also declare implicitly what kind of city Manhattan is willing to be. Late January 1908, the judge instructs the jury. The instructions are a kind of quiet architecture, built out of language rather than stone. They define what the jury is allowed to consider. They define how the jury should handle sympathy, disgust, and distraction. They attempt to narrow the world back down to a manageable question. Then the jurors go out. In deliberation rooms, the tables are plain. The chairs are hard. There are no chandeliers here, no velvet, no theater seats. Only the blunt setting where citizens are expected to reduce an enormous story to a single line of text. And this is where the scandal becomes an administrative act again. The verdict is written down, not shouted, not performed, written. The paper is carried back into the courtroom. The room rises. The clerk reads. The words land with the peculiar force of legality. Not guilty by reason of insanity. A verdict like this is not an ending, it is a transfer order. It means the defendant does not walk free into the street like an acquitted man. It means he is moved into another system, medical custody rather than prison custody. The trial ends, but another apparatus takes over immediately. A judge signs a commitment warrant. This is the document that matters now, a sheet of paper that authorizes confinement without a criminal sentence. It is the state's way of saying, we accept that you did this, and we accept that punishment is not the correct category, and therefore we will remove you from ordinary life by another route. The warrant is filed, copies are made, notifications are sent, and the defendant is transported. There are practical details that rarely appear in the dramatic retellings but shape the reality. How a person is escorted, what restraints are used, which officers are assigned, what rail line carries him north, what time the institution is prepared to receive him, what personal items are allowed, what is taken away and catalogued. At Matteawan, intake is its own ritual. Names are entered, physical descriptions, age, height, identifying marks, next of kin, the legal reason for confinement, the date of arrival, the names of the officials who delivered him. The institution's superintendent becomes, in effect, the new custodian of the story. This is the turning point of Chapter 7. Manhattan's most notorious scandal is no longer centered in a theater or a courtroom. It is centered in a locked facility with its own paperwork, its own rules, its own clocks. The city has chosen containment over execution. It has chosen diagnosis over punishment. And because the defendant is rich, because he has a family, because the press is watching, the institution will not be allowed to be invisible. From this point, the scandal changes texture. It becomes less about a single dramatic night and more about prolonged management, about petitions, reviews, medical reports, requests for transfer, appeals to authority, the slow, grinding question of whether a man judged insane can ever be judged sane again, and who has the power to make that decision. Evelyn's life, meanwhile, is already splitting into two tracks, the life she must live and the life the public insists she represents. She cannot return to anonymity. Her face is too known. Her name is too printed, and the trial has attached her to a story the public does not want to release. She is both witness and exhibit, both survivor and symbol. Manhattan has made her legible, and it will keep reading her whether she consents or not. In the months after the verdict, the city's elite adjusts the way elites always adjust, quietly, pragmatically, with attention to reputation as if it were a financial instrument. Some names retreat from public association, some continue as if nothing has happened. Some reframe the scandal as a cautionary tale about modernity, about the dangers of the city, about the vulnerability of young women, about the supposed decadence of artists, about the instability of heirs. Each framing is a way of protecting one institution by sacrificing another. The press keeps working because the story still has inventory. Matteawan becomes a word that sells papers. Medical examinations become content. Legal filings become content. The scandal has moved from rooftop theater to institutional corridor, but as long as there is paperwork, there is narrative, and the paperwork continues. Visitors are logged, letters are examined, requests are routed. If a wealthy family wants special treatment, the request must still be converted into an official action, because even privilege needs a form to travel through an institution. The question is not whether a verdict can close a case. The question is what a verdict creates when the city decides to treat violence as something to be managed rather than ended. What physically remains today is unusually tangible. The courthouse where the verdict was read still stands in its civic gravity, built to make individual lives feel small against the state. The institutional footprint of Matteawan still exists in the Hudson Valley landscape, through later facilities and the enduring architecture of confinement. And in archives, the case persists as a thick seam of documentation, trial records, institutional records, and newspaper accounts that together show how Manhattan's most notorious scandal was processed not only through passion, but through administration. Chapter 8. The Key, Matteawan, New York, 1908. The institution sits north of the city's noise, where the Hudson Valley feels like distance rather than escape. The air is different, the light is different, the sounds are smaller, but the rules are heavier. Inside, the day is built from schedules that do not care who a man was. Outside, a wake-up, a head count, a meal served on time, a corridor walked under supervision, a room entered and left with permission, names read against a list, notes written into a file. This is how the state turns a famous defendant into a contained patient, by routine. Harry Kendall Thaw is no longer an heir whose family name opens doors. He is a committed man inside a system that runs on keys and forms. Even wealth must travel through official channels now. Visitors are logged. Letters are controlled. Requests are routed. A favor becomes a petition. A privilege becomes an exception that must be recorded so the institution can justify itself later. The scandal does not vanish. It changes address. Reporters cannot sit inside the wards, but they can wait outside gates. They can ask staff for hints. They can track the arrival and departure of family members. They can watch court filings. They can turn every institutional movement into a headline because the public still believes the story has not finished paying. And while Thaw is held, Evelyn Nesbit is released into a world that will not allow her to be released from meaning. She is still young, but the city has aged her in public. Her face is still recognized, but now it is recognized as evidence. Every ordinary act, entering a theater, boarding a train, walking into a hotel, can be narrated as an extension of the scandal, because Manhattan has decided she is not just a person. She is a symbol that keeps the story coherent. She tries to build an income in the only ways the era reliably offers her: performance, appearance, the controlled use of her own notoriety. But notoriety is a volatile asset. It pays and it poisons. It attracts attention and it repels respectability. It makes her marketable and it makes her vulnerable. In the background, attorneys continue to do their real work, shaping institutional reality through documents. Because a commitment is not a simple cage. It is a legal condition that can be contested, reviewed, extended, or ended. It is not final, it is maintained. Doctors write assessments, superintendents sign reports, lawyers file petitions, judges rule on procedure. The story keeps generating paper because paper is how the state protects itself from the accusation that it is holding a man without reason. Meanwhile, Thaw's family has resources large enough to treat time as an opponent rather than a limit. They can pay for specialists. They can pay for investigators. They can pay for continued legal pressure. They can keep asking the same question until the system grows tired of answering it. That question is not in the family's framing whether he killed. That fact cannot be undone. The question is whether he should still be held. The institution's answer, at least for a time, is yes. Then the story turns on a detail as plain as metal. A key exists, a door exists, a moment exists when the surveillance is thin enough and the decision is bold enough. In August 1913, Harry Kendall Thaw escapes. It is an act that has its own physicality: clothing selected, timing chosen, a boundary crossed, a body moving fast under the pressure of pursuit. Once outside, there are further requirements: transportation, money, an identity that can pass, a route that avoids predictable checkpoints. Escape is never a single moment. It is a chain of logistics. He does what many fugitives in that era attempt when they have resources. He crosses a border. Canada becomes the temporary refuge because borders complicate custody. They slow the machinery. They introduce new officials and new documents. They require extradition arguments, hearings, and the kind of international cooperation that is not designed for speed. For Manhattan, the escape is an embarrassment and a gift at the same time. It is an embarrassment because it suggests institutional failure, because institutions are judged by what they can hold. It is a gift because it reignites public appetite. It turns a fading scandal back into a live chase. A new set of papers begins immediately. Notifications to law enforcement, reports written by the hospital, warrants, requests, affidavits. The case that once lived in a courthouse file now travels across jurisdictions. It produces duplicates and certified copies and stamped pages because every system insists on its own paperwork before it will act. In Canada, there are hearings. There are lawyers again. There is argument about whether a man who has been found insane can be treated as a criminal fugitive, whether he is escaping punishment or escaping custody, whether he belongs to the penal system or the medical system. Thaw is taken back into custody, but the return does not settle the question. It multiplies it, because the escape reframes everything. A man who can plan and execute an escape looks to some eyes like a man who can plan and execute a murder. The ability to move with strategy undermines the defense's old portrait of helpless collapse. It suggests competence. It suggests calculation. It invites the public to reconsider whether the city was too generous. Yet the law is not a newspaper. The law cannot simply change its category because the public mood shifts. It must address the category through procedure. Thaw is returned to institutional control, but now under brighter scrutiny. Officials do what officials always do after a public embarrassment. They document more. They tighten routine. They log every deviation. They attempt to make the record prove they are competent. The escape is the turning point of Chapter 8 because it moves the scandal into its final phase. Not the phase of passion, not the phase of courtroom spectacle, but the phase of containment contested by persistence. And persistence in American life often belongs to those who can afford it. By 1914 and 1915, the story approaches a new threshold. The question of sanity returns, again not as philosophy, but as a practical legal problem. If he remains insane, he is held. If he is sane, he cannot be held indefinitely under the same rationale. The institution's power depends on its ability to justify his custody. The family's strategy depends on its ability to erode that justification. There are new hearings, new examinations, new statements offered by doctors. The courtroom returns, but now with a different focus. The point is no longer to win an acquittal. That has already been won in the specific language of insanity. The point is to win a release, and release is also paperwork. A judge cannot simply say, "Go." The system requires terms, supervision, conditions, custodial transfers, the state's desire to avoid blame if something happens again. When Thaw is finally freed from direct institutional confinement, the scandal does not end with a clean moral conclusion. It ends the way modern scandals often end, with a legal status change that feels bureaucratic compared to the violence that started it. He is not transformed into an ordinary citizen by freedom. His name is too heavy. His history is too documented. His movements remain of interest precisely because the public still sees him as the man who shot Stanford White in a room full of witnesses and was then moved through the state like a special parcel. Evelyn Nesbit's later years move in a different direction, not toward quiet, but toward the long aftermath of being known for one story. She lives through a century that is changing quickly. New forms of celebrity, new forms of media, new forms of moral language. But the old scandal remains attached to her. It follows her through marriages and separations, through work, through the slow narrowing of options that comes when a public identity has already been written in ink. The city that once watched her testify ages into another Manhattan, taller, louder, richer in new ways, yet still recognizable in its habits. It still produces glamour and appetite. It still converts private life into public narrative. It still uses institutions to manage what it cannot morally resolve. The question is not whether escape proves sanity. The question is what sanity means when money can keep asking the court to redefine it. What physically remains today is a map of endurance made of stone, paper, and institutional memory. Stanford White's buildings remain in New York's visual vocabulary, monuments to taste that outlast the private conduct once whispered behind their walls. The courthouse system remains, still processing human crisis into files, still stamping pages that will one day be read as history. The places of confinement in the Hudson Valley remain as landscapes shaped by custody, structures repurposed, renamed, absorbed into newer systems, but carrying the same architectural logic of control. And in archives, the record remains thick. Trial transcripts, legal motions, newspaper runs, institutional reports, not because the story is mysterious, but because the story was never allowed to be simple. The question is not whether Manhattan created the scandal. The question is what Manhattan preserved when it decided to record it so completely. End of Chapter 8. Closing, the stamped New York County Courthouse, Manhattan. The building holds the same cool seriousness it held in 1906. Stone does not react to headlines. Wood benches do not remember applause. Corridors do not change their shape because a case once brought crowds. In an archive room, somewhere behind public spaces, boxes are arranged with labels that reduce lives to categories. Case number, defendant, year. A clerk's handwriting from a century ago still performs its function, to fix an event in a system, so the system can claim it understood what happened. Inside one of those files, the story exists in its most honest form, as administrative residue, a complaint, an indictment, a list of exhibits, a transcript of questions and answers, a verdict sheet, a commitment order, later petitions, requests, responses, the state's language, calm and procedural, moving over human panic the way a surveyor's line moves over uneven ground. That is what endures most reliably. Not emotion, not morality, documentation. Outside, Madison Square is still a crossroads. The old garden is gone, replaced by other uses, other towers, other crowds. But Manhattan's basic structure remains. People moving in streams, money moving invisibly beneath them, attention flickering from one spectacle to the next. The scandal of 1906 is no longer today's scandal. The city has produced too many since then. But the story still holds because it shows the machinery of modern life early and clearly. It shows how beauty becomes currency before it becomes protection. It shows how wealth can buy access and also buy narrative. It shows how institutions do not erase chaos. They file it. And it shows how a city can live with contradiction by turning contradiction into paperwork. In the end, Evelyn Nesbit is not preserved as a full life in the public mind. She is preserved as a figure in a case, a witness whose youth was consumed by older men's power, a woman whose face became a headline because the city could recognize her more easily than it could recognize its own complicity. Harry Kendall Thaw is not preserved as a full life either. He is preserved as a legal category that moved. Defendant, acquitted by reason of insanity, committed, escaped, recaptured, contested, released. A man whose wealth did not save him from confinement, but did give him leverage over how confinement was defined. Stanford White is preserved in two forms at once, as stone and as scandal. Buildings that remain upright, and a reputation that was pulled apart in courtrooms and newspapers after his death. Because the dead cannot sue for defamation, and the living always need a story that feels balanced. The city continues because cities always do. A clerk stamps a page, another clerk files it. Another clerk, decades later, retrieves it for a historian, for a journalist, for someone trying to understand why a rooftop theater became a national wound. The question is not whether the story ended. The question is what part of it the city decided to keep forever.